Hello all, how are you doing today? Thought I'd show, well, I don't have much to show um, this video, but I wanted to cover quite a few different little topics, show a couple new things in the game, and then throw at you some opinions, I guess, about things in general with 10.6 experimental. Now, to start with, some things I didn't show in past videos are some new parts. Um, and I actually didn't even realize that a couple of these existed until very recently. But in railings, there's quite a few new railings. In fact, there's a whole different set of them, and then some alternative parts for existing sets of railings. Very cool. These double things here, I think I could have definitely made use of in past builds. So, and of course in future builds. So that's very cool. And kind of what they look like on the new set here is kind of like this, which look quite realistic actually, in different scenarios. And they cast shadows on skylight. Not light you place though, but it's atmospheric light is where you get your shadows from. So that's a very cool thing. Another cool thing is there's more parts in the heavy windows, which I like to call fancy glass. Um, Quite a few new parts. So I mean, with all this, you can really create quite some fantastic glass work, I guess you could say. Of course, there was one thing that I wanted more than anything else, but I realized why it's not there too when I was thinking about it, and that is glass parts on the new set that could do these kind of angles, like your 22.5-degree angles and such. But I understand why they're not there because, in fact, that these glass pieces are like a half block thick, and to build parts to work at those angles at that thickness would be very difficult to do, and I can see why it wasn't done. So I get that. Um, see what else is going on here. Okay, well, on Monday's video that I made, I said I wanted to do a video and build a SV that is designed to move HVs, and I did kind of start doing that, and I actually recorded it, but I didn't upload the video because what happened is I kind of got discouraged halfway through this build. Um, Basically, I started thinking about deeper aspects of the whole thing. First aspect was, what would I use this in my own game? And keep in mind, single player, okay, or single player, or even if I was on a multiplayer server, probably playing solo. Um, and my answer came out to be no, I wouldn't use it. And the reason why, first, the scenario I would want to use this in would be that I have a CV that's not capable of landing on the planet's surface. So, therefore, I would want to get my HV to the surface using an SV. Now, the HV could be a tank, could be a miner, whatever HV I've got. Um, so, in the scenario, if you play it out, so I fly down, I jump out of this, I jump into my HV, I run around the probably nearby area, either mining or tackling some POIs. But then I got this big liability, and that is the SV sitting there defenseless, uh, where any drones could come by and start blasting it while I'm out and about doing my business. And it's very possible I return after doing my business and my SV got blown up. And now I'm stranded on the planet with an HV tank and can't return back to my CV. So, with that in mind, I was like, geez, would I do this? And I kind of got a little discouraged building it. And then also, my concept of what I was trying to build in the first place, I think, is flawed. Now, I like the idea of having like this big surface area here where you could drive a HV and dock it up to the top here. Well, then I ran into some nasty logistical issues, and that is mainly about how do I get in and out of my SV. And of course, I was trying to go with the internal cockpit, as I've been kind of swaying towards that more and more with newer builds and not using the prefabs, because I feel this is more immersive overall, and I kind of like the feel of it more to some extent. But the logistics of having an internal cockpit like this and being able to get up and into your ship and have interior space up here, I didn't really have any good solutions on how I would make a ramp getting up that high. And if I did, it would have to be like off to the side somehow over here and not block the center area. And then I realized that my entire design was kind of flawed in its general concept, and I sort of abandoned it. And that's kind of where I'm at. And my only solution really around that is to not have an interior at all and replace the glass with a prefab cockpit so I could leap up and jump into it. But it wasn't exactly what I wanted to build. So I'll think about it some more. And someone else suggested that, well, you could also have like drive the HV like up on some kind of ramp, and then the SV can lift it that way. That could work. It would probably be easier to pull off than what this is. Do I think it would look good? Probably not. I don't think it would have necessarily a neat, cool look to flying. I don't know. I don't even know what you'd call it. Haven't seen any real planes or anything that work that way. So, all right. So next thing is I noticed that the flight model with the update that I seen happen this morning, at least, I don't know exactly when the update came through, but when I first turned on the computer and logged into Steam, I seen that Empyrion got an update. And that update actually is made a nice improvement to the flying in the new flight model. Basically, what I've noticed before was it felt really jerky when I was flying around. It would kind of like yank over a lot and stuff. And then I found that even problematic to be like accurately firing on like turrets. You know, like if this tree over here was a turret, before I was kind of like jumping around all the time when I was trying to aim right at it. And now that has smoothed off drastically, and it's fairly pleasant at this point. So that's cool. Next aspect would be there's a comment about this one here saying that SV without warp or shield is kind of useless. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that myself, but I can see the point, and I don't know the difficulty settings, you know, the other players playing the game in, etc. And there's a lot of things out there, and that might be exactly what they prefer to use. And I get that, because, I mean, when I build ships, there's certain things I like in a ship or don't like in a ship on the functionality I would want it to have. So on this ship, I was kind of investigating the idea of what it would take to make this have those features. Where would it sit at CPU tier levels with those features, and how big or small could the ship be? And I ran into some logistical issues with at least this design with that. When you think about it, say this is a tier 3 ship and it doesn't have warp and it doesn't have a shield, therefore it doesn't have a taxi tank, it doesn't have enough generators to make the shield operate when you're flying nicely, at least. And then you've got this other thing of CPU blocks, and of course, where in the heck are you going to put the warp core? Now, and like the warp core also generates heat and radiation, so you can't be like right next to it. So on this design, at least, I ran into a huge amount of problems with how I would actually make it have those things, since it wasn't designed originally to accommodate them. And a couple of the issues I had is I really don't have a spot to put the warp core. My best thought would be to carve away this ceiling area here, kind of bring this up a little bit so I could kind of fit the warp core in above your head, hopefully by at least a block space, so you don't get fried when you walk in and out. Placing the shield's no big deal. It's pretty small, and I actually had a home for it over here already. I could always carve out a part of a wall so I could make a spot to put in a pentaxa tank. Possibly even do that with a couple more generators. Although it's tight, there's not a lot of space in this thing. But then I've got this other issue too with the CPU blocks, where I've got them currently embedded in the wall, and at tier 3 it needs 2 of these 2x1 CPU blocks to achieve that. And upgrading the CPU, you'd want to remove these 2 and replace that with essentially 4 2x1 blocks. And well, with the current design, I don't have the housing or spacing available to do that either. In fact, I would kind of want to keep the CPU blocks visible to the player so they could remove them easily, and then also have additional room in that same spot to add in more CPU blocks. So in that, dealing with CPU in the first place, kind of reducing the overall size in which you can build stuff and be at least 100% efficiency, it's very challenging. Of course, if I built this from ground up to be used with these parts, it would be a T4 ship, and the goal with this one is I wanted to build a T3 with particular functionality in it, being storage and weapons, or basically being able to engage the POI and carry away the loot. That was my big goal on this one. But the shield and the warp core was omitted because of the cost on CPU. And then if I wanted that kind of stuff, it would be a T4 ship. I could build a T4 ship and probably make it do all the same stuff and hold these parts nicely. So I believe it's absolutely possible. But even when building this ship, trying to get it to do the goals I wanted to, which I don't think are that steep, it was kind of annoying to build it. Just constantly having to look at numbers, and do I want to add some more detail blocks over here because they cost a little bit against CPU as well, and that is something. Blocks count a certain amount of CPU. Now, pretty low, but the bigger materials, so like with the SV, your best material is hardened steel. Using a hardened steel block versus a steel block costs a little bit more CPU. Now, it doesn't cost a lot of CPU for blocks, but once you start getting bigger creations, you'll notice that you're using an awful lot of CPU in blocks itself. And then I was kind of, I guess I didn't really have a size comparison because this one had an interior and stuff, and it feels kind of roomy. And also, by the way, when I add all this stuff, it's turning like crap again. Unfortunately, I didn't change the thrusters, but I'm turning left and right, and it's sluggish. And I think that changed a little bit too. It seemed to be not as sluggish before. But now I'm like really cranking the mouse over here, like constantly, like full direction, so I can make this turn and land. And now I almost think it needs an RCS, but the RCS costs too much CPU to use, so therefore I don't want to do that. Maybe it needs more thrusters, but then I'm going to blow my tier 3 CPU and blah, 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 blah. Basically, it's just frustrating. It's frustrating, and I know all this is just is up there so we can get used to it and weed out all these little issues and things like that. And I am seeing definite improvement to the flight model. Speaking of flight models, there's another design type, and that's dealing with aerodynamics and a different kind of way to build a ship and fly it. And that's pretty cool. And basically, you don't need thrusters in all your directions. In fact, you could put a couple thrusters in the back of some ships, and if they're wide enough and have enough surface area on the bottom, that they kind of fly in the atmosphere, and then you can get away with not having all these different kinds of thrusters all over the place. And one other thing too is if like you cut your speed while you're in the air, then you're going to drop down to the ground. That makes a lot of sense. Same thing would happen with any kind of plane or jet out there right now flying in the atmosphere. If you kill your engines, it's going to fall to the ground, unless it's a glider that's specifically made to glide for a very long time. So that's kind of cool. Adds in like a new aspect of something you could build. The only side effect, well, there's a couple side effects to it though too. With everything, there's pros and cons. The con on that type of ship, it's really cool that you can save a lot of CPU on the amount of thrusters that you're using. But because of the flight model, you then need to add in some RCS, or you're not going to be able to steer it. And once you add in the RCS at the cost that they are, you're not really saving anything on CPU. You're just designing a ship that flies differently, more or less. But I also heard, but haven't tested or built one of these yet, that they don't do well in space, flying around. So, so you got, it's a positive that you definitely can build a new style ship, but then the limitations on it are also kind of, I don't know, troubling, I guess. But but they make sense, and with some imagination and playing around with it, I'm sure you can come up with some pretty useful creations that way. Let's see. Next thing, and this is more basically kind of going into the past with comparisons to the current new CPU model versus the old CPU model. And this is something that kind of bugs me a little bit because I kind of feel that parts of it don't seem right to me. Let me explain. In this, when I was building a lot of CPU ships, the whole theory was to use these bigger thrusters and fewer of them to give the most amount of thrust versus the CPU used. So when I set out to build, like, my target goal was to build a destroyer with like pretty close to max weaponry and combat steel with a shield, I wanted to keep as much available CPU as I possibly could for all the guns and all the other stuff I would want in the ship. And keep in mind, I also like to build pretty much every CV as a player base. So that is something I basically, with my own playstyle, would want in all CVs that I would ever use in game. Not just like, So I'm a little bit at odds on why the specialization of or having more than one CV to do different tasks does not fit at all with the type of playstyle I've always done with the game, at least. But I could see it for like co-op in multiplayer things. If I had more crew around and people could be operating different ships and stuff, it'd be a different scenario. It'd be interesting. But so when I built like a ship like this, I was using these great big thrusters in here, and now which kind of hurts is the fact that these great big thrusters are extraordinarily expensive in CPU. In fact, at tier 4 gives you 1.6 million total CPU for a CV, and one of these thrusters takes up a third of that. Just one. Which is basically making them unusable now. And I regret building this ship in the first place because, or building, in fact, 7500 CPU compliant things in such a manner that I was trying to be as optimal as I could in the design to fight the CPU. But now I'm penalized for it because now a ship like this, although I can get this to be CPU compliant, it requires modifications that I think look hideous, such as blowing away all these thrusters that are, where the ship was specifically designed to hold that size thruster in the mounting places for it, and then replacing them with some kind of smaller thruster that doesn't fit right anymore, and it looks stupid. And then I can't get by with like one thruster per direction like this because I need to have that torque with the thrusters, so I would need essentially more thrusters or something to counterbalance the one on the front and the back, or I would need to run RCS, which costs a fortune, to steer again. And if you're trying to be CPU compliant, using a RCS, for instance, like in this case, the regular RCSs aren't very powerful, but the T2s are. But look at that CPU cost on it, 1.25 million. Are you serious? You cap a ship out at 1.6 million, and you're making a single RCS cost this much? Well, that certainly forces you to not design a ship in this manner, which is absolutely totally against what the last iteration of CPU was. And I do find this annoying. I feel like I wasted an awful lot of time embracing the last CPU at this point in time to be knocked in the face and punished for doing it. Or at least that's how I feel about it. So on another aspect of all this is, even if this newer ship was a T4 and had these parts in it, and let's just say, for instance, it was a little bit bigger, because it would probably have to be to hold all these other parts and keep things safe. Look how dinky it is in comparison to all the other ships I've been building lately. Now, granted, some people, maybe I'm building stuff too big, but this is what's fun. I don't want to build this little stuff all the time. It's fun sometimes, and it can be a bit of a challenge, but I certainly like to let loose and build other things. And that gets to one point, and it's a big one, and that is that CPU is totally optional. So moving after this experimental version, I don't have to care about CPU. And in this case, as restrictive as I'm finding it to be, I highly doubt I will build much using it. But as an author who, would like their creations to be usable by as much people as possible, it's going to restrict, a lot of the builds to where a certain group that might be using the new CPU tier wouldn't want to use because, well, they wouldn't work. And I get that, but it's kind of a bit of a downer on my part, where it's like I could get a lot of these other ships to actually work even with the old tier CPU, but now that's too much yet again. One last aspect that's kind of irking me a little bit too, and this has to do with the cost of constructors and things like that, and the availability in-game to get CPU blocks. Now, as I know right now, you can build the tier 2 ones, so you can build up to like a tier 2 right out of your constructor or whatever. But if you're in game and you want to build a tier 3 or tier 4 ship, you need to buy from a vendor or find in POI loot the blocks needed to do that. So thinking about that a little bit is like, my first experience with the game was I actually built all my first creations in survival itself. And a lot of times, especially when I started building bigger and more advanced things, I would you know, I wanted a place where I had a bunch of constructors so I could, you know, queue them all up to build parts simultaneously in a lot of cases. And that's why I kind of adopted the idea that I typically like a fair amount of constructors, and especially in a CV or a base, which, you know, in a CV is my base. Once I get a CV, I'm mobile. I can bring my stuff with me, and that's why I always put in hangars and landing pads and all that stuff, so I can bring my HVs and my SVs with me and be mobile and go explore the solar system, or in upcoming iterations of the game, multiple solar systems. So I could see the need to be nomadic even more so than it was in the past. Um, and I don't know how that is supposed to work with multiple CVs. In fact, as a single player, I can't control more than one CV, nor would I ever want more than one CV at a time, simply because what do I do with it? You know, I just park it somewhere and leave it, or, you know, if I build a new one that's got more functionality and more room and more storage and all that stuff, do I just deconstruct the old one? So that's kind of an aspect I'm thinking about. Like, I don't know how that would work. Um, but I know that's what the devs are also pushing for, and also with the build, you know, needing to find the CPU blocks or buy them in game. Um, I guess I'm not against that. It's kind of challenging and could add an aspect of the game and get excited to find some neat loot of a CPU block. But I think overall it would encourage people not to want to build much in game and instead rely on the workshop or prefabs to build stuff. And what I think is kind of at its heart against what I thought this game was about, in a way, you know, because why I found and liked this game in the first place is because I was building stuff in the actual game to overcome challenges and learn how to build better and progress in the game. And now it's kind of like, and now it seems like with the cost of constructors and the availability to get blocks needed to do that in the game, that it's actually discouraging people from building in the game, to some extent. And I don't think that's necessarily right for a game like this. So I'm curious on all your thoughts. I mean, these are just my thoughts. I don't know exactly where I stand on things right now. Obviously, I'm not quite as happy as I was on my last video about things. And, you know, the other information that I got as well, too, which is kind of discouraging, but I do need to test this, is I was told, like, when I switched the Tachi over to be CPU, or work in a 10.6 environment. Of course, I got rid of all the RCS and put in the CPU blocks. It was at 82% efficiency, and it flew quite well. But then I was told that in a survival game, that doesn't actually translate quite the same, and it probably won't fly the same. And I still need to go into a survival game to test and prove that. But and another problem I've always kind of had too, and it's with weights and volumes. It's, you can overcome it, but it's kind of annoying, and that is the fact that, again, survival or the creative mode doesn't do the weights and volumes. So when I'm building a ship here and want to test it, I gotta, like, end the game, spawn the ship into a survival game, and just do a lot of extra steps and things, and take more time. And if I don't got it quite right, then I go back to the creative game, make some modifications, end the creative game, go back into the survival game, test again. And I don't know why they're not synced. I guess why can't you have that stuff in the creative environment so you can actually test it when you're building stuff? And if that's the case, also with the being over on CPU, where we're getting different numbers between one mode or the other, that's kind of problematic too. And I would just want to see it kind of synced up. You know what I mean? So I'm not getting the wrong idea. about one thing on how it's going to work. Now, one last thing, and this is completely rumor that I've heard, or maybe it's not rumor, maybe it's fact, I don't know yet, but that once 10.6 goes public, the penalty for going over CPU will be 50% more severe than it currently is. So with that information, with both the Tatsi possibly not being able to fly as well in current survival, plus an additional 50% penalty on its overuse of CPU, all my happy thoughts about being able to save a lot of my ships kind of went out the window again. And it's been kind of demotivational, I will say. So even when I fire up the game currently, I'm like puttering around with something, and it's just like, I don't know. I don't really want to build anything at the moment until all this works itself out, and then see where it's at, So I don't know. I'm kind of at a wait and see aspect of it right now. And even with this, with the changes being made, the amount of time it takes to build these creations in a final state, like this little bugger over here, it's not that big, but I bet you it took about 9 hours to build it. I don't want to waste that kind of time for dead on arrival creations. It seems pointless and very wasteful of my free time, which I could be doing other things and enjoying myself more with. So there's that aspect. I'm really curious on all your views on this, and I almost kind of want to be told that I'm overreacting and that I'm overthinking it, because it's quite possible I am. It's just, this is just kind of how I'm seeing it currently, and I got to say my motivation levels are pretty low on building right now. It's kind of like most of it, besides the new blocks and the new stuff that I really do like, all seems discouraging, and it seems like the kind of stuff I want to build with the game versus the direction the devs want the game to be in are at odds. So I almost feel guilty by building things I want to build, because they're not complying to where the devs would like to see the game go. And more separation of who's going to want what kind of creation, which as an author, you have to realize that you can't please everybody, and no matter how great you think something is, other people aren't going to like it for whatever reason it might be. And everybody's got their choices and opinions on everything, and what I like might be completely different than what a different player likes, and I totally understand that. But just adding more camps, I guess, with people of wanting different kinds of creations. I mean, of course, there's a PvP crowd, and they want PvP stuff, and then there's the role-playing crowd, and they're more into immersion and that kind of stuff. And then there's me, who tries to go on the middle ground of everything. So I'm trying to make things that are kind of a bit role play, but also work in game. But I also don't cover PvP, and in the future, I don't think I would do much in covering CPU either. So that puts me at kind of a smaller group of potential people that would sub my stuff. And as an author, I don't like that really, and I don't think any authors would. So again, just my opinion. Anyway, y'all have a good day. Hope you enjoyed this, and please, I definitely want to hear from you on your opinions on all this stuff. All right, thanks a lot. See you later.